When I heard that Karen, the HOA president, was planning a neighborhood campout with over 100 people, I knew it was going to be trouble. I had no idea she could be this brazen. But then again, this was the woman who once fined me for having a flower garden that didn't match the aesthetic of our street. Karen's need to control everything was no secret, but inviting 100 strangers to camp right outside my house crossed a line I wasn't willing to tolerate. Most people would have tried to reason with her or maybe avoid the situation. But not me. I had a plan, and it involved unleashing my dogs on the crowd. It all started with a simple email from Karen. "We're having a community camp out this weekend, and you're invited," she wrote, with a cheery tone that could only be described as passive-aggressive. I could feel my blood pressure rise as I read the email. I knew exactly what she was up to. Karen had this weird obsession with community bonding, but what she really wanted was control, to prove once again that she could dictate what everyone in the neighborhood did, even if it meant disrupting lives for the sake of her own ego. The campout wasn't just a casual weekend gathering. It was a full-blown spectacle. She was bringing in tents, lights, campfires, and, of course, her ever-expanding army of HOA cronies to patrol the event. I couldn't believe it. What did she think? That she could throw a huge party in front of my house, and I'd just let it slide? No, I wasn't about to stand by and watch as she made a mockery of everything I stood for. The truth was, I had a plan, and it wasn't about confrontation, at least not in the way she expected. My dogs, Max and Bella, were already stirring in the backyard, sensing the excitement building inside me. They were my secret weapon, and I've been training them for months. I've been waiting for the perfect moment to put them to use, and this was it. If Karen thought she could use her position to manipulate the neighborhood, she had another thing coming. The dogs were more than just loyal companions. They were my response to everything she stood for. As the campout drew closer, I started to feel a mix of excitement and nervous energy. I could see Karen's smug face already, imagining the power she'd have over all of us. But what she didn't realize was that I wasn't going to let her get away with it. There was no way she could expect what was about to unfold. This wasn't going to be a simple move your tent situation. No, this was going to be much more. By the time the weekend arrived, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Karen's campout had become the talk of the town, and everyone was wondering if I'd give in or just ignore it. What they didn't know was that I was preparing for something far more entertaining. I could hear the sound of Karen's voice echoing through the block as she barked orders to her followers, arranging the tents and directing people to their designated spots. The setup was in full swing. And as much as I wanted to run outside and confront her, I stayed calm. This was going to be better than any confrontation. It was going to be a lesson Karen would never forget. As the sun began to set on that fateful evening, the campout was in full swing. Karen and her army of followers had set up their tents, and I could already see them making themselves comfortable, treating the whole street like their personal playground. I watched from my living room window, the weight of the situation sinking in. My dogs, Max and Bella, were now pacing in the backyard, sensing the anticipation. It was almost time. I could hear the chatter of the campfire ring growing louder, with Karen at the center, barking orders and making everyone feel like this was her moment to shine. But what she didn't realize was that, in her desire to control every aspect of the neighborhood, she had ignored one very important detail. She had underestimated me. As the evening progressed, more and more people arrived, all in their camping gear, settling in for what Karen had promised would be a night to remember. They were all too busy chatting and setting up their tents to notice the slight rustling in the bushes, where my two dogs were waiting, their eyes fixed on the growing crowd. Max was a large German shepherd, and Bella, a fast-moving border collie, both perfectly trained to follow my commands. They had a job to do, and they were more than ready to execute it. I could hear Karen's loud voice cutting through the air as she walked around, inspecting the setup like she was the queen of the block. Her eyes occasionally glinted in my direction, but she had no idea what was coming. She had crossed a line, and this was my way of showing her just how wrong she was. It wasn't long before the first few guests started to realize something was amiss. The dogs had been quietly moving towards the perimeter, strategically placed in the backyard just beyond the fence, where they could observe everything. I had intentionally made sure there was just enough space between the fence and the crowd for them to slip through undetected. And that's exactly what they did. In a matter of seconds, Max and Bella were through the gap, moving swiftly into the crowd. The first scream came from one of Karen's followers, who was startled by the sudden appearance of the dogs. But it wasn't just any scream. It was a high-pitched, frantic one. As the dogs moved in, others followed, creating a chain reaction of chaos. People scrambled to get out of the way, shouting and stumbling over each other. Karen's face twisted in disbelief as she turned to see what was happening. But it was too late. The dogs were already doing their job. They weren't attacking, but their presence alone was enough to send the crowd into a frenzy. The campers, who had been so confident just moments before, were now running in all directions, some tripping over their tents, others knocking over coolers and camp chairs in a desperate attempt to escape. The chaos spread like wildfire, and it didn't take long for the entire campout to turn into a scene of pure disarray. I stood back, watching through my window, feeling a sense of satisfaction I hadn't known I needed. Karen, the HOA president, who thought she could control everything, was now completely powerless, her carefully planned event unraveling before her eyes. I knew this wasn't just about the dogs. It was about making a point. Karen had spent months trying to dictate how everyone in the neighborhood should live. She'd find people for things as insignificant as having a slightly overgrown lawn or painting a mailbox a color she didn't approve of. She had a long history of overstepping her bounds, but this campout was the final straw. I wasn't going to let her take control of the neighborhood, not without a fight. And while I could have gone out there and confronted her directly, I knew this would be far more effective. The dogs had given her a taste of her own medicine, and it was just the beginning. Karen stood frozen in the middle of her campout, staring at the scene around her as the dogs moved between the campers, still chasing down stragglers. It was a sight to behold. The terror in her eyes was palpable, and for the first time, she realized she had made a massive mistake. As people fled in every direction, Karen tried to assert some authority, shouting at everyone to calm down and ignore the dogs. But it was clear she had lost control. Her perfect neighborhood event had been reduced to pure chaos. I could see the confusion on her face as she attempted to regain some semblance of order, but it was too late. Her reputation as HOA president had taken a massive hit, and it wasn't just the neighbors who were watching. The dogs had made sure of that. The chaos continued for a few more minutes before I called the dogs back, signaling them to return to the yard. Max and Bella, having done their part, trotted back to me with their usual sense of pride. I knew this wasn't the end, but it was a start. Karen would have to answer for what she'd done, and this little stunt would make sure that people in the neighborhood wouldn't forget. As I watched her try to regain control of the situation, I couldn't help but feel a sense of victory. Karen, who had tried to turn this peaceful neighborhood into her personal domain, had been put in her place, not with confrontation, but with a little unexpected chaos and a couple of well-trained dogs. As the chaos settled down, Karen's smug demeanor had disappeared completely. She stood there, looking like a deer caught in headlights, as the crowd slowly began to disperse. Some of the campers were still laughing nervously, while others were shaking their heads in disbelief at what had just transpired. The sound of scrambling feet and frantic voices began to die down, and the only thing that remained was the lingering tension in the air. Karen was still trying to gather her thoughts, her arms flailing as she gave orders to her followers, but it was clear that her authority had evaporated. The campout was over, and Karen's plans had been completely derailed. I watched from the safety of my home, feeling a sense of satisfaction that I had never known before. I had turned the tables on Karen in a way she could never have anticipated. She had spent months using her position as HOA president to control every tiny detail in our neighborhood, from the color of fences to the types of flowers we planted. But this time, I had exposed her for what she truly was, someone who was willing to push others to their breaking point, all for her own selfish sense of power. The dogs had done their job, not just by causing a scene, but by sending a loud and clear message that Karen was not untouchable. It didn't take long for word to spread throughout the neighborhood. By the time I stepped outside, the campers had scattered, their tents left abandoned on the lawn, and Karen was still standing there, fuming and red-faced. She had lost her grip on the situation completely. Neighbors who had been quietly watching from their windows or porches now began to come outside, some looking curious, others amused. They were all silently acknowledging what had just happened, and for the first time in a long while, I saw them looking at Karen differently, no longer as the unchallenged leader of the HOA, but as someone who had just been put in her place. It was hard not to feel a sense of triumph in that moment. Karen had thought she could use the HOA as a means to control everyone, but all she had done was reveal her true nature. She had assumed that the campout would be a display of her power, a way for her to show everyone who was in charge. But instead, it became the very event that would mark the end of her reign. Karen's once loyal followers were now beginning to question her authority. They saw her for what she truly was, someone who was willing to bully and manipulate others for her own gain. And just like that, her power began to crumble. In the following days, things quickly began to change around the neighborhood. Karen, once the queen bee of the HOA, found herself isolated. Her attempts to rebuild her authority were met with resistance. The neighbors who had been too scared to speak out against her before were now emboldened. They started to speak up about the unfair fines, the ridiculous rules, and the constant harassment they had endured at her hands. It was no longer just a handful of people speaking out. It was a movement. The campout incident had sparked something bigger than Karen could have ever imagined. I didn't need to do anything else. The dogs had done their job, and the neighborhood was beginning to heal. People started to hold meetings without Karen, discussing how they could take back control of the HOA. The new atmosphere was one of cooperation, not fear. Karen's grip on the neighborhood had slipped, and she could feel it. The moment she had planned to use as a demonstration of her power had turned into the biggest mistake of her life. It didn't take long for the first signs of her downfall to appear. Her supporters began to pull away, one by one, unwilling to be associated with someone who had lost her credibility so completely. Within a week, Karen's reign was effectively over. The HOA meetings were no longer dominated by her presence, and she no longer had the power to fine people at will. Neighbors began to take action, organizing a community cleanup and planning events that actually brought people together, not divide them. It wasn't just the dogs that had won this time. It was the whole neighborhood. And as Karen was forced to back down, it became clear to everyone that no matter how much power someone thought they had, there was always a way to stand up against it. I had learned that sometimes you don't need to fight back with words or arguments. Sometimes all it takes is a little unexpected chaos, a couple of dogs, and a community willing to take back control. And just when I thought the situation couldn't get any better, the final blow came when Karen received a letter from the HOA board. It wasn't an order, it was a resignation letter. The board members, who had once been her loyal followers, had all decided to step down. They cited her increasingly erratic behavior and her inability to lead the community with fairness and respect. Karen's days as the HOA president were officially over. The neighbors, now united, chose new leadership, and for the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt like a real community, not a dictatorship. As for Karen, I'm not sure what happened to her after that. She moved out of the neighborhood shortly after her resignation, leaving behind a trail of frustration and broken promises. But I'll always remember that night when the campout turned into chaos. I'll remember how, with a little help from my dogs, I was able to turn the tables on someone who thought they could control everything. It wasn't just about winning. It was about showing Karen and everyone else that sometimes the best way to take back your power is to do the unexpected,